Nearly 150 heads of state and government are expected in New York next week to attend the United Nations General Assembly. The stakes couldn't be higher with conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza, the climate crisis and the 2030 agenda. I had the chance to speak with Fernanda Espinosa. She's the first woman from Latin America and the Caribbean to serve as the president of the UN General Assembly in 2018. I began by asking her about the 80th anniversary of the United Nations and the path forward.
In these 80 years, there is no doubt that the UN has played a central role in maintaining peace, in advancing development, in promoting human rights. And when you see the UN deployed in the field, you see humanitarian relief, you see health, immunization to children. I think that we have to recognize that the UN has been the pivot of international law and conflict response. And I think that the beauty of the UN is that its universal membership and legitimacy remain absolutely vital in today's divided and polarized world. So I think that in going forward, basically the task ahead is to revitalize trust in multilateralism in general by ensuring that institutions, including the United Nations, are more responsive, more effective, more inclusive, more fit for purpose to really address the issues of today's world. And I think that perhaps the key, the secret, is to connect the links between global frameworks and local impact, especially in cities, will be absolutely key for the way forward of the United Nations.
Now, China has played an increasingly active role in the United Nations over the past decades in the UN system. How do you view China's contribution to what the UN does, especially in areas like peacekeeping, development, global governance?
Well, I think that it is the responsibility of all member states to contribute to the health of the multilateral system. So I would say that constructive engagement is absolutely essential. And that's what we have seen from China. So I think that we have witnessed China's growing role that reflects bigger and broader shifts in global governance, with emerging economies playing more visible roles. And I think its shift towards perhaps more locally rooted, people-centered development efforts is very encouraging to see. With regards to China, we have seen China also step up in terms of contributions, financial contributions to the UN, both to the core budget, but also to the peacekeeping operations, being now the second funder and contributor, and also connecting the dots between the local and the global. I'm thinking about initiatives, for example, the new small and beautiful approach, and that, of course, reflects the value of investing in sustainable community-level solutions. This is a space, for example, where the Cities Alliance has been working for the past 20 years. The Cities Alliance being the organization that I have the honor to preside over. So I think that what matters is how these contributions uphold UN principles, strengthen global cooperation, honor the UN Charter, but also the responsibility to constructively address the urgent need to reform, to transform, to modernize the organization.
Just on that question of reform, and you talked a moment ago about revitalization of the United Nations and its core function, which is to work in a multilateral environment. I mean, this is something that has concerned you for some time. 7 years ago, you became only the fourth woman to become president of the United Nations General Assembly. We talked to you at the time. You gave an interview at the time in which you said, we are really living in a very troubled environment, and I think it is very important that we really work towards strengthening of the multilateral system. And even then, you mentioned the word revitalization. What needs to be done right now?
Well, I think that, as I said a few years ago, I can repeat the same today, which is that multilateralism is under strain. But nevertheless, it remains the most legitimate framework for global cooperation. Uh, but of course, the complexity of today's crises, from conflicts to climate, mostly happening in cities, by the way, demands collective solutions, collective action. And basically, what I meant then, and I repeat today, is that the UN must evolve to be more people-centered, to be relevant, to address the issues on the ground, especially in the response to urban challenges, for example, but to many other challenges, such as the climate emergency, the issues of the use of artificial intelligence, the massive human displacement due to conflict or climate, for example. So the crises, multiple crises that we are experiencing really require countries, governments coming together to find solutions, to cooperate more, to connect more, to coordinate better the responses. And this universal platform to do that remains the United Nations.
How does the UN become relevant, especially cooperate when member states, big member states, powerful member states have such divergent views on key issues? I mean, you mentioned the climate emergency, for instance. It's one of the signature challenges of our time. Many countries are on board as far as how this problem is tackled, how to solve it, how to slow down climate change. But we also have a country like the United States, which has twice pulled out of the Paris Accords. So where are we now in this fight?
I think that science and evidence show that the climate emergency is not something of the future, it's something of the present. And it's hurting economies, it's hurting lives and the health of people. People around the world. Before we used to say it's really affecting the countries like my own in the global south, it's affecting small island developing states, it's affecting the landlocked countries. And it's true because they are the most vulnerable countries and geographies to the climate crisis. But at the same time, we see, the fires in California, we see extreme heat in cities of Europe. So it's happening everywhere. And the response to climate change, once again, has to be collective. And there is a principle in the convention, the Climate Change Convention of the UN, which basically recognized common but differentiated responsibilities. And here again, the role of cities, the role of local governments, it's absolutely vital. Countries that have committed uh, to a just transition in terms of their energy matrices. And for that, China is the leader as a producer, the number one producer of renewable energy. So we see that that's the path.
We're also seeing something of an impending crisis when it comes to food and water security. Global demand for food is expected to increase by 50% by 2050. Are these issues getting enough attention?
I think that in terms of the climate crisis is interconnected. It has to do with land use, with food systems, with urbanization and urban planning, with energy use. In a way, climate change is the microcosm of a dysfunctional economy and in our uh, development pathways that are self-destructive in a way. So basically, there is a very close connection between land use changes, food systems, and in the climate emergency. We are witnessing rapid urbanization, for example, environmental degradation, not only we expressed in climate change, but also in the loss of biodiversity, in increased pollution, air pollution, for example, which is affecting the health of millions of people around the world, and the issue of resource scarcity. When I speak about resource scarcity, of course, I think about water and land, basically. So these challenges demand integrated solutions, especially in how, for example, we manage cities, we conserve land, and the biomass, the green, the forest, for example, how we design housing, infrastructure. There is a big push for low carbon infrastructure, while urbanization accelerates around the world. So local planning, for example, and community-led initiatives are crucial to ensure the sustainable use of resources and long-term food security. We also know in the paradoxes we live is that the world produces enough food to feed everybody in this planet. But the issues of access, of distribution, are hurting us because there is a huge and profound inequality and injustice on that front too. Global policy guidance is crucial. And here again, the role of the UN is extremely, extremely relevant. In the spaces of the negotiations of climate during the Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Climate Change, but overall, when we think about delivering on the sustainable development goals, when we think about the urban agenda, when we think about the health agenda, they all come together. Very unfortunately, our world is defined by interconnectedness and complexity. So we cannot afford to go through like band-aid approaches. We need a holistic approach, and for that we need also, collective action. We need to work together. We need to cooperate. We need to coordinate. And again, the platform to do that it still is the United Nations.
Next, we turn to the climate crisis and efforts to protect our ecosystems and oceans. I spoke with Astrid Schomaker, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and asked her to weigh in on the United Nations accomplishments and challenges.
Well, I think the United Nations is one of the most significant achievements of humanity, if you want, in modern times, and has made enormous achievements, especially in the areas of peace and security and sustainable development, bearing in mind that most of the crises we are facing today are trans-border, sometimes even continental crises. So we need a body like the United Nations to help us solve these issues. And it has enormous convening power. It brings the world together to, around shared goals. And then we do not always achieve those goals, but the goals focus collective attention on certain areas, and then we move forward towards them. So let's take in the area of biodiversity I work on. We used to have Aichi targets. We moved towards those targets. We then replaced them with the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and we're making progress towards those targets. So that is very important. But more than that, you see the UN very often act in the background, bring people together, create, the space to discuss complex issues that sometimes countries are not able to solve on their own. So we have a lot that the UN has been doing in the area of peace and security. We have 70 peacekeeping missions around the world. I think since the foundation of the EU, 11 or so are active now. We have disarmament treaties that were concluded with the UN acting as the convener and making them then UN brokering those treaties. So there's a lot that is happening in that space, and I think looking forward, we have no organization is perfect. I think there's a lot of discussion around UN reform, how we can deliver basically ever more effectively and efficiently, and that's an important conversation to have. And I think going forward, modernizing our operations and looking at the structures we have and how they deliver is very important.
You mentioned those peacekeeping missions. Of course, China has played a key role in those peacekeeping missions, as well as development, as well as global governance. How would you assess China's role at the UN?
Well, let me focus on the area I work in so that I can judge best. And there, I think China's contribution to global environmental governance, and particularly to the biodiversity agenda, has been remarkable. So China was the president of our COP15. So that was a remarkable multilateral process. So leading up to the conclusion or to the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which contains really unprecedented ambition and global commitment to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. And that was brokered by China as president of COP15. And then China went beyond that. You helped put this in place. But then China created the Kunming Biodiversity Fund, which is providing significant support to developing countries to implement the framework. China put in place an action initiative around the Global Biodiversity Framework, calling on countries to come in together and actually implement. But all of that is one thing. What really matters most to me is walking the talk, if you so want. And I think there as well we can say that China is doing that. So China has updated its national biodiversity strategy and action plan and has adapted it to the 2030 ambition. But then, looking at China's domestic efforts, establishing a system of national parks, I think there are a lot of work around eco-red lines to minimize socioeconomic impacts of industrialization and of development on biodiversity. We're looking at regulations safeguarding ecosystem services. So there's a lot happening in China, and I think that's very encouraging.
Now, that Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, it sets out 23 goals or targets, including protecting 30% of land and sea by 2030. What can you tell us about how implementation of those goals are going so far?
Well, if I'm honest, it's a bit of a mixed picture. So many parties have already established at least one, often more than one national target to implement the global targets. There's a lot of focus on the target that you mentioned, the 30% target. It's a bit early days to really have a very clear sort of view on where we are in implementation across the board. For this 30 by 30 target, we are not doing super well. Around 10% of ocean areas that are being protected, just under 18%, I believe, of land areas. So there's a lot more that has to happen. And it's also important in that space that we don't just look at the figures, not just the percentages per se, but at the quality of the land that is being protected. So are these the most important and the most vulnerable ecosystems? Are they managed in a way equitably and with the participation of indigenous peoples and local communities? And then also very, very importantly, once an area is declared as being protected, is that protection actually effective, and is it backed up by real, let's say, enforcement and monitoring? But then, this is the one target everybody looks at. It's like a lighthouse target, and it's important. But we really have to understand that there are 23 action targets, and we need accelerated action on all of them. So next year, at our COP17 in Armenia, in Yerevan, in just about a year's time, we will do our first global review, and then we will have a clear picture where we are in terms of advancing towards the 2030 targets and where we have to pay particular attention and accelerate the most.
You have talked about the wake-up call that nature is issuing when we look at the disasters that are taking place, natural disasters, when we look at the loss of biodiversity, when we look at ecosystems collapsing as well. What do you think are the most critical political, financial, and societal shifts that are required right now to turn this, this crisis that you're talking about into action?
Well, I think when we talk about go into action, we always have to be scientific and science-based. And science is telling us very clearly a couple of things. First of all, that the biodiversity crisis is not a crisis in isolation. Biodiversity loss and climate change, but also pollution and land degradation, all these things are directly linked. And what would be really very, very harmful, I would think, is if you would just say, let's solve the climate crisis first, and when we're done with that, we move to biodiversity. I mean, this is not how biophysical systems work. So we need to basically do everything at the same time and in an accelerated manner. So that is that's quite challenging. And when we turn to scientists and say, what does this really mean? They talk about transformational change. So it means really a departure from the prevailing development models and also from the prevailing socio-economic models, including our linear economic models, and moving to a circular economy to lower the pressure that humankind puts on ecosystems and the planet at large. So that is very, very important. At the same time, this also sounds quite frightening because we know we're in this decade, we need to take this action. Time is running fast. So what it really means, we need all hands on deck. We call that in the UN a whole of government and a whole of society approach. Those are nice terms, but what it means is that environment ministries can't act on their own. They must bring the whole government along. They must speak to industry, energy, agriculture ministries, etc., and make sure there is a common vision for an economy that values nature and is built on nature. When we look at the business sector, it's the same thing. Business cannot have an approach by which they take nature for granted. Their business models are built on nature. They need to give back to nature. They need to monitor and assess their impacts on nature, disclose them, and then adapt their behavior in such a way that their business activities can go on, but not in a way that they harm nature. And then each and every one of us needs to look at their behaviors and factor nature in. And you also mentioned the finance sector, and that is, of course, very, very important. Finance sector can send signals to business. You would not, as a responsible financier, you would not want to finance operations that are either not sustainable over time, because you would finance a stranded asset, or where you would know that the activities of a business are really harming nature or contributing to more climate change. So the finance sector would be very interested, should be very interested in those disclosures, and then adapt its behavior accordingly.
Yeah, on the question of finance to preserve biodiversity, there were pledges made of $25 billion by 2025, but that's fallen far short. So what about other models like public-private partnerships to close that gap?
Yeah, so closing the finance gap is one of our biggest challenges, to be very frank about that. Our target is quite explicit, both for 2025 and for 2030. It has various aspects. It talks about reforming harmful subsidies, which is a very, very important part of it. It talks about stepping up development aid, so richer countries to poorer countries, but also it speaks a lot about domestic resource mobilization. And in this latter part of the domestic resource mobilization, public-private partnerships can, in my view, play really a critical role. I mean, they could help bridge the finance gap. So in particular, if the state works together with the private sector and could help de-risk, for example, private investments, or come forward with concessional loans, or have co-investment arrangements. And all that is necessary because investing in nature is still not as well known. The benefits of it are not as well known. The risks are often seen as higher than they are in reality. So there is a need, I think, for states that have committed to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework to step in and attract investors that might otherwise be, reluctant to engage. And we have also That's maybe one, not directly private-public partnerships, but a very important breakthrough in terms of how business can contribute to the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and that is the Kali Fund. It was operationalized at COP16, but decided already under the Chinese presidency at COP15. And that is the idea that companies that use digital sequencing information from genetic resources for their businesses, so that build their business models on this freely available information, would share these benefits with those that are essentially protecting biodiversity. So it is a means to bring greater equity into global operations. And for that, we now have a fund where companies that use a lot of this information are being asked to pay into the fund. And of course, we're asking governments, here comes the public-private partnership idea back, we're asking governments to support companies, to incentivize companies so that they are actually paying into this fund, which is now open to receive contributions.
Now, the United States has not joined the Convention on Biological Diversity. In fact, it stepped back from its broader commitments to environmental preservation. How does that affect efforts?
Well, it is true. The United States have been probably the only big country that has not signed up to the CBD. We have 196 parties. So, but the US has always been active in protecting biodiversity, both globally and domestically. There have been a lot of support programs. There's a lot happening also that individual US states are doing to protect biodiversity. They have been very engaged over the years in our conferences of the parties. Even not being a party, they've contributed to the discussions, and we welcome these efforts. And I think I've said before, we need all hands on deck. The biodiversity crisis is a serious crisis. It is a deepening crisis. It has to be addressed together with the climate crisis, and for that we need everybody on deck, be they states, be they subnational entities, be they cities. We see a lot of work, for example, in US cities, many mayors very engaged, very local communities very engaged, and all that is very welcome and necessary.
My thanks to Astrid Schomaker for her insights on the United Nations and biodiversity. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.